everyone. I'm Jim. Doug was my stepfather for 32 years. In fact, he was such a big part of my life and had such a big impact on my life. That I don't actually remember a time without Doug. If you knew our relationship, you would know that he would want me to give this speech. I thought about writing it down in case I couldn't do it, but he would have wanted me to do this. So, the good thing about Doug is he had a lot of patience, so we're going to need a little bit probably here. You also know that he wouldn't want me to Google how to do one of these. He would want me to do it my way, so, Father, no disrespect to the church, but this is my way. The good news is that I had a chance to talk to Father Pat yesterday, and he told me about someone's experience in heaven, and there's a bar, and so my rendition is not quite that, but if you knew Doug, then you knew he was a great storyteller. His stories maybe weren't so great, but the way he told them was great, and they had a few elements to them. They usually had some grandiose gestures, hands movement. In fact, even in the last few weeks in the hospital, one time he asked the nurse to take off his blanket, and she said, "Oh, are you hot?" And he said, "No, I just need to make some grandiose gestures." And they usually had some sound effect in there, like the old Batman movies, like a boom or a clank or something. I think maybe it's because the stories were long and you wanted to make sure you were awake. He usually would ask you a question in the middle of the story that was almost impossible to answer. There was not enough color, enough context to be able to answer it. And then at the end of the story, he'd have to give you one of these emphatic motions like this and say, the point of the story was this because you were smart enough to understand it. And so I figured, in true Doug fashion, I'd give you the story about what had happened when he got to heaven a couple days ago. So, he got to heaven, and he saw the white gates, beautiful gates. And then he saw St. Peter at the door with the clipboard, kind of like a Las Vegas nightclub, checking people in. And the line was mile long. And Doug naturally went to the back of the line. And as he was in the line, all of a sudden a little angel floated over right in front of his face, like a little Tinkerbell angel, and came right up to his face and said, "Do you know Rose Neary?" And he says, "As a matter of fact, I do." And Rose, for those of you who don't know, is my mom's mom, and she truly was an angel. She passed away in August. And the little Tinkerbell angel said, "Well, good thing that you know Rose, because you're going to have VIP. You don't have to wait in this line and get right to the front." And so he walked down the line, you know, up to the front of the line. He gave one of these nods to St. Peter, and the doors swung open. And there he saw Rose in the distance, standing by her husband John. Now keep in mind that Doug had never met John because John passed away in September 1976. But there was Rose, and Rose came running up to Doug and gave him the biggest hug you've ever seen. And she said, "Doug, I can't wait to tell you all about heaven, this magical place. But first I'd like you to meet my husband John." And so Doug walked over and stuck out his hand. And John did not want any part of that handshake. He wanted to give him a big hug, so he held his arms. Is this glorious? Is this gargantuan enough for a gesture? And he held out his arms really big, as if to give him the biggest hug in the world, and Doug did the same thing. And next thing you know, John popped him in the stomach and boinked him on the head. And Doug says, "What kind of welcome is this?" And John says, "Well, for the last 6 months, Rose and I have been on the rocks, and it's all your fault because of the wish." And Doug says, "What wish?" And Rose says, "Well, Doug, when you get up to heaven, God will grant you one wish, and it will come true within 10 years, no matter what. It can be anything you want. It will come true within 10 years. And John looked over at Doug and said, "Well, you know what my wish was." And Doug said, "Well, how would I know that, John?" And he said, "Well, think about it. Exactly 9.5 years after I passed away, there was a magical event that happened." Doug says, "I don't know." And he boinked him on the head again. And Doug says, I can't imagine what that could have been. And John says, "I'll give you a clue. The score was 46-10. And Doug said, you mean to tell me your one wish of anything you could wish for was for the Chicago Bears to win the Super Bowl? And he said, yes. And he said, when Rose got up here, he said, we had the biggest, after the Bears won the Super Bowl, we had the biggest party you've ever seen. And when Rose got up here, I wanted her to wish for that same thing. And so for every day, for weeks, I would talk to Rose about wishing for the Bears so we could have this magical party again. And Rose was like, John, there's just other things that are more important than the Bears. And he said, I don't think so, Rose. And so every day for weeks, he would try and get her to convince her to vote for it. And finally, Rose had enough. And it was the middle of October, and John said, listen, the Bears are 4-4, and they have a chance, if they can win out the rest of the season, they can get to the playoffs, God will take it from there. Go in there and talk to him. So Rose had enough, and she said, okay, John, I will do that. And so she walked up, and she had her one-on-one sit-down with God, and she said, God, after much deliberation, I have come with my wish, and I wished for the Bears to win the Super Bowl again. And fire spewed up from everywhere, and God said, are you sure, Rose? And she said, yes. And then he came down from his throne, and he came down, and he put his arm around Rose and said, Rose, I know that you can wish for anything, and anything will come true within 10 years, but I just can't grant that again. We made an exception for your husband 30 years ago, but the Bears are just this bad. We cannot make this happen. And so Doug is so confused, and he looks over and he says, I still don't know what this has to do with me. And that's when Rose came up and gave him the biggest high five you've ever seen. She said, everybody thought it was the Russians and the FBI, Doug, but it was me. I used my wish for Trump. And you know that story is true because there's not a chance in the world that man would have won without Rose. And now for the emphatic point. If you thought that story was about sports or you thought it was about politics, it wasn't. It was about the impact that Doug had on my grandmother's life. You think about this lady, I guess 70 years ago, a congressman gave her a free garbage can, and she became a Democrat. And so for the first 75 years of her life, she was a Democrat, tried and true. And it took Doug about 22 years to convert her to the other side, but that was the kind of impact that Doug had on Rose's life. And you think about the impact that he had on all your lives. And so for me, he impacted my life in 3 ways. Through commitment, through confidence, and through kindness. And you think about commitment. Here's a guy that when he was 19 years old, he got diagnosed with diabetes. And he made a commitment that day. He didn't feel sorry for himself. He didn't put his head in the sand. He made a commitment to beat this disease. And you can imagine 56 years ago, I don't even know if there was TV back then, the technology to be able to measure blood glucose levels had to be horrendous. But he committed to beating that disease. Now, I think my mom saved his life no less than 100 times. And I don't think she's had a good night's rest in the last 32 years, making sure that he was okay in the middle of the night. I saved him a handful of times myself. Is Lou Hagemeister here? I don't know if I ever met her before, but there's Lou in the back. So there's a story that my mom tells that one time Doug called work and said, he called Doug and he was at his desk and he didn't answer, and he called him again. I'm probably gonna mess this story up, but she called him a few times and he didn't answer, so she called Doug's good friend Lou and said, Lou, can you go check on Doug? And sure enough, she went over and checked on him, and he was in some bad shape, and so Lou did what she had to do, give him some Coca-Cola or whatever he needed to get him up front. But the point was Lou went into her boss's office, was right across from Doug's, and says, if you're going to sit next to Doug, you're going to make sure he's okay. And it was pretty rare for an employee to be able to do that, but that's what happened. And probably the most amazing story is that, as Father Pat mentioned, every year we go to Michigan, and there was a time where Doug decided to go swimming in the lake, and he went into one of his diabetic comas there, and John David, who's sitting over here, was able to get out there and swim out there and somehow magically save him. It was unbelievable. And then you think about the commitment that he made to his work. He worked at ITW for 35 years. That doesn't happen anymore. But it was his commitment to his job that enables him to lead the life that he's been able to live. He was able to retire when he was 57 years old. He was invested smartly. He never took any risks. But it was his commitment to his job that